First of all, just welcome everybody to today's AGP webinar. Thanks very much for taking the time to attend in what's a very busy time, I know, for all of us. So my name's Lucy Jones. I'm the AGP Project and Compliance Manager. So I'm going to be helping facilitate the session today alongside Leslie, who's our expert delivering the webinar. So just to go through a quick few housekeeping rules, some of which Leslie's already covered. So just ensure your microphone stays muted, just to avoid any interference or background noise. There will be a Q&A session later in the webinar, so obviously you'll need to switch it back on for that. As Leslie said, there's a chat facility which I can see some of you have started using. If you prefer to ask any questions on here, feel free to just type them in, and Leslie's going to try and answer as many of these as possible. And also, if you need any support during the webinar, I'll be monitoring the chat. So again, just ask away. Just to let you know, the webinar is being recorded. This just helps us to collate any questions, comments that we might miss during the webinar. So if anyone's got any concerns or questions about this, just let me know. So Leslie, if you can just go on to the next slide.
Yeah, apologies, good one. I will just say this is the first of 3 webinars that we're running this week, and we will be running some next week, and there are some more currently being developed. So please bear with us in terms of this is the first one of these that we're running. So I'm afraid we're testing our team.
Great, thank you. So the only thing to say, so you will, after the webinar, you're going to receive 2 emails. Firstly, we do require you to sign a digital registration form, which will come from our e-signature platform, HelloSign. This literally takes less than a minute. It just gives you a link to follow just to sign. This allows us to confirm to Welsh Government that the webinar took place and how many of you attended. So it's really important that you do sign that, and we will chase up any missing forms. You'll also receive an email with a link to a couple of surveys just to provide feedback to us. So we greatly appreciate if you would complete these. So I will hand over to Leslie now, and she will carry on with the webinar.
I'm just going to stop the video so that it's not distracting for everyone, and hopefully you can all now see the slides. If you do have any problems, by all means put it in chat, and we'll try and keep an eye on chat in case anybody is experiencing difficulties. Okay, so the seminar, I think you have already mentioned, Lucy's seminar is being delivered in line with Excelerator Consortium. So we've developed a number of webinars, as if three of which are being run this week. More details will follow then later on this week. So thank you for joining me for the HR webinar. We're going to cover 4 main areas that were sent out to you in advance, effectively looking at how to effectively manage the size and shape of your workforce during the crisis that we're currently experiencing. So what I'm going to do is I'll run through the 4 sections with you. There's then a short action plan at the end for you to look at how you might put that in place. I'll go over with you some additional support that's been identified as part of the AGP programme, and there will be, as Lucy said, an opportunity for questions and answers. So as we keep being reminded, we're in unprecedented times, and as business owners and managers, I'm sure you've been considering over the last few weeks how you can afford to maintain existing staffing levels with the potential for, or the reality of, in lots of cases, a downturn in business. On Monday this week, obviously we had further measures put in place restricting how some businesses can trade unless they are classed as essential. So I've kind of put 3 questions as a starting point just to help you try to formulate a plan, which is to think about in the short term and then the more medium term, what impact are you expecting the COVID-19 virus to have on your business? And then looking at, do you understand kind of the makeup of your staff? I mean, for some of you, obviously your businesses will be smaller, you'll know very much the size of your businesses, but do you understand the makeup of those staff in terms of the numbers and the types of contracts that you have in place? So to give you an understanding of what flexibility you may have, and to look then at the contracts look at what arrangements you might have in place. Flexibility already built in, and obviously I'm going to go through some of those with you, as well as a bit more detail in terms of the government scheme that has been put in place. So I understand that what I'm talking about potentially can feel quite unpalatable to lots of people, because you've got established relationships with your staff, and the decisions that you're potentially been having to take are not easy ones. There are grants and loans potentially available. Coronavirus business interruption loan has been talked about a lot over the last few days, and payments being offered by the government to assist businesses to cope with a downturn in business. We are going to talk about obviously the coronavirus job retention scheme. But aside from those, by reviewing the contracts that you've got in place, as I said, you can see what flexibility you might have to reduce your staffing budget in the short and medium term. So looking at straight away, the coronavirus job retention scheme, it's only recently been announced. In some ways, there's more questions than there are answers at the moment. But what we do know is that under the scheme, all employers will be able to access to support to continue paying part of their employee's salary for those employees that would otherwise have been laid off during the crisis. So what's been given is, or what's been identified rather, is 80% of the salary, up to a maximum of £2,500 per month per employee. We don't know yet whether that includes deductions or whether that's just the maximum of the overall benefit, up to £2,500. What we do know is that it's been said this includes all employees on PAYE, including those on 0-hour contracts. And again, I know that throws up questions in terms of how do we pay those on 0-hour contracts? And we're expecting calculations to come from HMRC in terms of how you might average out those 0-hour contracts in order to make those payments. So in order to be able to claim the support, you need to designate your employees or those relevant employees as furloughed workers. And once you've then done that, you need to make sure that you notify your employees, obviously, that they're classed as furloughed workers. This is relatively easy for those employers that have layoff clauses in employment contracts, because they will be able to write to employees telling them they're classing them as furloughed workers for the purposes of being able to claim the support for the salaries under the scheme. And that's to remember that this is as an alternative to layoff, so where those staff would have otherwise been laid off. This will, however, only cover their pay. And technically, as things stand, because we haven't had clarity, it looks like employees will remain entitled to all their other benefits. So they will still accrue annual leave if they have lease cars, mobile phones. Those benefits will still remain in place. And that's unless employers can seek to negotiate a temporary suspension of benefits as an alternative, again, to laying staff off or to making them redundant. So this may be conversations that you need to have with your staff to say, we are classing you as furloughed, we can't afford to pay the benefits that we pay you. Are you happy that we take away those benefits for this period? Because the alternative could be redundancies or layoffs. Now, if you don't have layoff clauses in your employment contracts, then you'll need to consult with your employees on the changes. And again, negotiating also that you were going to treat them as furloughed staff. So if businesses have already had to close, then they will seek to negotiate retrospectively, either with trade union reps where there might be collective agreements in place, or with individual employees. I do recognise that logistically that is not as simple as it may sound, but as things stand, that is certainly the guidance that we are seeing. Now, before you look at, or as well as looking at the coronavirus job retention scheme, you can look to your employment contracts and other clauses that you may be able to rely on. I'm going to talk about types of contracts in the next section, but as I said, there may already be some clauses in place that you can use to give you some flexibility at this time. So those workers who are not on annual leave, who are not on sick leave, can be instructed to take annual leave by you. And that's as long as they're given at least double the length of notice to the leave to be taken. So if you want an employee to take a week's leave, you need to instruct them to take it 2 weeks before it needs to be taken. I get that means you can't plan in the immediate term, but it's part of a strategy, part of a plan that you can look at. How can I manage the group of staff that I've got? I've already got a commitment to annual leave. Actually, I can utilise it in this way. And then potentially later on, I haven't got those annual leave requests coming in either at a time when I do want to get the business back up and running at full strength. So if you are furloughing employees, in line with what I've already discussed, when you intend to bring them back into work, you might not want them to start requesting to take periods of leave immediately. So what you could do is instruct them in advance of returning to take periods of annual leave. Of course, this will be paid on a contractual basis, and it won't form part of any coronavirus job retention scheme payments that you will then look to claim back from the government. So layoffs, we've already talked about layoffs in terms of how you can utilise the layoff clause for furloughing employees. But many employment contracts do have a layoff clause that usually says when the organisation reserves the right to invoke layoff clauses where they may be necessary. So effectively, a layoff is where you ask an employee to stay at home or to take unpaid leave where there is not enough work for them. Being asked to not to work for one day is classed as a layoff. And short-term working, which is another clause quite often that sits alongside layoffs, is when you need to cut your employees' hours. So as outlined in the previous section of the webinar, you'd need to have a contract clause that allows you to lay off or to implement short-time working. And if you don't have that, then you would be looking to continue to pay your staff full pay, even if there's no work for them. So if your contracts don't include a layoff clause, as I've said, you need to consult with those staff if you do want to look to lay them off or you want to implement short-time working. Again, it's a conversation that you can have. This is a potential alternative to making you redundant. And staff can then also potentially access universal credit benefits in order to top up any guarantee pay that they will be entitled to, and they still retain employment. So once work is available, you can then bring them back into work. So technically it might be a more attractive prospect to them than being redundant and not knowing that they will have a job at all. If you don't have the clauses I said, you haven't got an automatic right to invoke the clause. So therefore you need to get the agreement and you need to get that signed. If you don't, then potentially it could be something the employee could raise as a breach of contract matter with an employment tribunal. And if you can't if you've been through this process, you've looked at layoff clauses, you've looked at the retention scheme, short-term working, and you may then be in a situation where you do need to consider commencing with redundancy. And we'll cover that in the third section of the webinar. So just to tell you a little bit about guarantee pay, if you don't know about it at all, if you've got a layoff clause that means you don't have to pay employees their full pay, you do still need to pay them guarantee pay. And if short-time working hours are proposed to be cut by more than 50% of contracted hours, then guarantee pay is also triggered for short-time working. It's paid at a rate of £29 a day, but it is, however, only payable for a maximum of 5 days in any 3-month period. So what it was designed for really is to put in place where you haven't got work, you've got a contract that's due, you haven't got work for 1, maybe 2 days. In some senses, it wasn't designed for this current situation, but it is something that you can utilise in this current situation. You can, of course, choose to pay more than the guarantee pay rate during any period that you can't offer work, but you must at least pay the £29 a day. And if employees don't work full-time, then the guarantee pay is prorated. So any employee with more than a month's service is eligible for guarantee pay. They must, however, ensure that they are actually available for work, and they mustn't refuse any reasonable alternative work. So there's no limit to how long you can lay an employee off for technically, although you do need to be aware if they've been laid off for 4 weeks in a row or for 6 weeks in any 13-week period, they're entitled to apply for redundancy, and therefore they may at that point be entitled to a redundancy payment. This is, of course, subject to having 2 years continuous service. Now, that said, if you have a contractual, you could have a policy in place for redundancy that does give enhanced redundancy rights for less than 2 years service. But it is fairly, not many employers do tend to have that in their contracts. There is further advice or further details in terms of layoffs and short-term working on the gov.uk website. In fact, a lot of the resources available there are quite useful in terms of coronavirus, and they are being updated fairly quickly that I'm finding. Now, one thing for you to be aware of is if you are going to lay off some staff members and not others, because you may find that you could manage with a shorter number, you do need to be careful that you can justify your reasons for doing this on a business basis and in a way that wouldn't be seen to discriminate against any particular group or particular individual. Moving then to, and I also should have said, or to target part-time staff, because this may be seen as less favourable treatment, in the same way. Moving on then to the different types of employment contracts, I'm going to cover different options that you may be available in terms of reducing time relying on these, staff working time relying on these contracts. Permanent contracts, we've already covered the clauses likely to be included in those contracts for the most part. We're obviously going to cover redundancies in a later section. Fixed term contracts, annualised hours, 0 hours contracts, and even though freelance contracts aren't employment contracts, I've included them because again they're an area that may give you some additional flexibility. So looking at fixed term contracts first, it's important to think about the fact that, be aware of the fact that fixed term employees must be treated the same as permanent employees. It's quite common, something that I come across quite commonly. People have fixed term staff in place and they automatically think, well, if I end those fixed term contracts, then I won't have to make other people redundant. Those individuals will be covered by fixed term less favourable treatment legislation. So you do need to be careful that you don't end up falling foul of that by thinking it's as easy as just letting those staff go. And you also need to be aware that fixed term workers who've been on a continuous contract for 4 years or more are likely to be classed as a permanent employee. So even if they have got fixed term in the title of their contract, if they've been employed for 4 years or more, you need to treat them as you would a permanent employee. Again, something that commonly people put on staff on rolling temporary contracts without realising that they've then triggered that 4 years service. So it depends on the reason for the fixed term contract. It might be possible to end the contract early on the basis of a downturn in business. If, for example, the contract is based on a project being delivered and then that project is no longer able to be delivered because the current circumstances, the client is no longer able to offer the contract, for example, then quite often there will be a notice built in to say we give you notice if we need to with a contract that needs to end earlier. Same as when a contract sometimes will be on a task and finish basis, so it ends when a specific event takes place. Then it can be quite common to say actually that specific event has taken place. One of the things that you need to be aware of is if a fixed term contract is in place, for example, for a year, then there is usually a commitment, and it is in dates. There is usually a commitment for that contract to be honoured for that period. So you do need to be confident that the wording in the contract does allow you to end the contract early. And as I said, that again, a fixed term employee is not being targeted when potentially a permanent employee should also be considered, for example, in a redundancy situation. Moving on then to annualised hours contracts. I don't tend to see too many of these, although you do in some seasonal staff, some particular types of work do use a lot of annualised hours. They tend to exist largely where there's a demand for a particular skill set for part of a year and less of a demand at other times of the year. And they're used often to retain essential skills and valued staff on an ongoing basis. So they all include an outline of how it's expected the hours will be worked across the year. However, they may also include a clause that allows flexibility to reduce the hours to be worked at another time in the year based on business need. So again, if you've got an annualised hours contract that has got the clause, you could give the notice to reduce the hours while there's the downturn in business, and then increase the hours when it's anticipated that the work will increase. You do need to just be mindful of how many hours the employer is contracted to work in a year and whether you're going to be able to utilise the existing hours when you're looking at this option. So moving on then to 0 hours. So 0 hour contracts, often referred as well to as casual contracts or temporary workers. These staff are usually employed either for a set piece of work on short notice basis quite often, or they're bank staff, they're on call. Some people do rely on 0 hours contracts when sometimes what they should probably have in place is fixed term contracts. So it's not unusual for that to exist in the workplace. So the main stipulation around 0 hours contracts is that you're not required to give the person on the contract any work, and they don't have to do any work when you ask them. So as long as you're engaging your 0 hours workers properly and you're not using them regularly so that they could demonstrate a regular pattern of work over a set period without breaks in service, you could tell them that you don't need them for the foreseeable future, or if there were to be some clause around giving notice, then you could give notice that you wouldn't need them. Okay, moving on to freelance contracts. If you hire freelancers, consultants, contractors, they are self-employed or they're employed as part of other companies and then brought into you, usually through an umbrella company. They're quite distinct in the sense that they look after their own tax and national insurance contributions, and they tend to invoice you for the work that they do. I know there's been a lot in the press recently over IR35, which obviously includes this group of staff, but at this time the IR35 has been put on hold. So it is quite usual for a contract for services or a freelance agreement to have a clause within it that allows you to give notice to the freelancer and that the freelance contract will end. And that's even if the work offered was for a set piece of work. So it's worth checking the clauses, see what's in place, and see how you can potentially end this contract as a way of avoid laying off your own staff. And this moves me on then to the third section, which covers redundancies. So in what circumstances could it be the right decision to make looking at redundancies? You've reviewed your employment contracts and freelance contracts. you've looked at the clauses, you've reviewed the government's coronavirus job retention scheme, and you've decided that unfortunately, even with all of those measures, potentially you are going to have to consider redundancy for one or more of your employees. One of the key things you need to consider is, what is the definition of redundancy? So an employer's need for an employee to do work of a particular kind ceases or reduces, or the business in which the employee is employed is shut down either entirely or at one of the business locations. So the first question to ask yourself is, are you confident that the above describes what's happening in your business, that the work is diminishing or the business or site will need to close? And important to remember that redundancy is a reason for dismissal, and therefore the employment will end through dismissal on the grounds of redundancy. And that this is the case even if the employee applies for voluntary redundancy. One of the things that you will need to evidence when looking at redundancies is avoiding compulsory redundancies where possible. So as long as you can demonstrate that you've considered the alternative options, for example, the ones that we've been through already in this webinar, before you look to make redundancies, then you should be able to demonstrate that you have sought to avoid compulsory redundancies. You might also want to consider offering employees to apply for voluntary redundancy before you consider compulsory, and where possible, restricting recruitment to vacancies and redeploying staff who are at risk of redundancy instead of losing them to compulsory redundancy. If you do need to make compulsory redundancies, you need to identify which employees will be made redundant, and that will be based on a business case that I'll go through with you in a little bit more detail. And also make sure that you select people fairly, that you're not discriminating in any way in your selection process. And fair reasons for selecting employees for redundancy usually focus around the skills, the qualifications and the aptitude of the role, the standard of work and or performance, attendance and disciplinary record. It's usual to draw up a scoring mechanism to assist with this part of the process in order to be able to demonstrate that you followed a fair and transparent process. You also need to make sure that you consult with staff, and as I said, you kind of follow a framework of business case for change. Looking at redundancy consultation, if you don't consult with employees, the decision to make someone redundant might be seen as unfair. And you need to follow collective consultation rules if you're making 20 or more employees redundant. There aren't set rules to follow if they're less than 20, but it is still good practice to fully consult employees and representatives if you recognise them, because an employment tribunal might decide you've dismissed your staff unfairly if you don't. Now, there is further guidance available, as again on the gov.uk website, on ACAS, in terms of following principles for collective redundancies. But a fair consultation process will involve making employees aware of the business case for change, giving them as much information as possible in order to be able to understand the reason for the change. So the business case for change includes the outlining the reasons for the change, the impact on the company of the change, and the impact on the company if you don't make the change. As I said, that any measures already taken to avoid redundancies. You need to be very clear about the numbers of posts being put at risk and the description of the roles being put at risk, so people can properly understand, does that include me, does that include my role, and what other roles in the company are included. Because quite often through the process, people will ask questions about other posts that haven't been put at risk of redundancy. And as I've outlined, selection criteria needs to be clearly outlined, what mechanism for scoring you're going to use, to outline how employees can follow the process and the timescales, how redundancy payments will be calculated, whether you're going to follow a statutory process or whether you've got contractual redundancy payments that are enhanced that the employee would be entitled to. And the same with notices. Are you following statutory notices, or are you going to be, or do you have your own notice periods within your contracts? Where there are options for suitable alternative employment, obviously further details of those should be outlined, and it needs to be clear that there would be the right of appeal during the process. So just to be clear, employees who are at risk of redundancy must be met with on an individual basis, and that's to go through the business case. For them to be able to respond, it's usual to have at least 2 meetings before final decisions are made, and then an appeal process as well. I recognise again, for some organisations where employees are not in the company at the moment, logistically that could be quite difficult to do, but there are ways around consulting remotely that are obviously some organisations are having to put in place at the moment. Redundancy selection. So once you've had the consultation, you've been through the business case with the employee, the selection process then commences. So a decision's been made, you're going to make the redundancies, and then you will measure a pool of staff who are at risk of redundancy. Once that process has ended, those who have effectively scored the lowest in the process will be made redundant, informed of their redundancy, which given them details of the estimate of their pay and their notice, confirming their last day of employment, their right of appeal and how they can appeal. Looking at redundancy pay, statutory redundancy payments in themselves, as I said earlier, only employees with 2 years service are entitled to redundancy payment unless you give more in your policy and procedure. Statutory redundancy payments are based on age and length of employment and count back from the date of dismissal. So employees get 1.5 years service for each full year of employment after their 41st birthday, a week's pay after their 22nd birthday, and half a week's pay for each full year of employment up to their 22nd birthday. And there are redundancy calculators online, and the maximum amount of statutory redundancy payable is £16,140. That's based on the 6th of April rates, because they go up every year on the 6th of April. So redundancy payments are tax-free up to a maximum of £30,000, and employees who've been made redundant only pay tax on payments over £30,000. They don't pay any national insurance. Moving on then to statutory redundancy notice. So as you can see here, this is effectively the statutory notice unless your contract gives more. There are occasions where you might want to pay in lieu of notice, and if that's included in your contract, then you can decide to do that, but you don't have to. And if an employee requests it, again, it's discretionary. It's up to you if you wanted to allow that. There are different support mechanisms available for redundancy. Internally, you're required to give reasonable time off to attend interviews, and externally there is Job Centre Plus and Careers Wales React scheme in Wales that employees can be signposted to for additional support. So moving on to the final section of the webinar, which is paying staff, what to pay staff who are unable to attend work. So this is slightly different, but again, in terms of the brief of the webinar, it is a question that's coming up a lot at the moment. So we thought it would be of benefit for you to hear it. So we've got several common scenarios at the moment explaining why employees may not currently be in work, as outlined on the slide. So in the scenario where the employee may be working from home, it's assumed that you're providing them with work, they're undertaking it, and that therefore their pay is unaffected. That is, however, unless they're being placed on short-time working, and it may be that they're working from home but on reduced hours. In the scenario where the government has instructed the business to close, then you will have considered the short and medium-term impact of the forced closure in line with the questions that we've already identified, looking at the job retention scheme, furloughing workers, laying off temporarily, placing employees under short notice working, and reducing overall staffing numbers through redundancy. So where individuals are self-isolating, the statutory sick pay coronavirus amendment regulations came into effect on the 13th of March, and they state that a person is deemed incapable of work where they are isolating themselves from other people in such a manner as to prevent infection or contamination with coronavirus disease in accordance with public health guidance. So effectively, the new regulation means that in most cases, an employee who is in quarantine or self-isolation will be regarded as being incapable of work for SSP purposes. Therefore, where employees, for example, have been instructed by the government to shield themselves because they are classed as an individual in a seriously vulnerable group, they're also classed as incapacitated and will be entitled to SSP for the period that they're incapacitated. And we know, we've already been told, that this is likely to be for a period of at least 12 weeks. And in this case, the government have said that they'll support SME employers only at this time to claim back the first 14 days of SSP. So obviously that does fall short potentially of what some of those individuals may need to be paid. Again, if an employee is entitled to contractual sick pay, however, it's likely that they are going to be entitled to contractual sick pay for that period, depending on what your policy says. If it's not contractual, though, it's discretionary, you may have the option to pay SSP only. And again, even if it is contractual, you could seek to negotiate as an alternative to having to lay staff off, that you can, that they may accept that they will be paid SSP and not contractual sick pay. But that is something that you would need to negotiate with staff. Just to talk about pregnant workers, if due to the nature of her role, a pregnant individual is unable to work from home, then you would need to consider suspending her on full pay in line with the Management of Health and Safety at Work regulations. We've already talked about individuals who are in self-isolation. So that's whether they're following the guidelines because they are experiencing symptoms or because a member of their family is. That potentially could be for 7 or for 14 days, depending on whether they live alone or whether they live with other individuals. And again, the government have said that they will support SME employers to claim back the 14 days and that employees can be paid SSP from the first day. Now, there is an option for employers to request an isolation note from the NHS. I have noticed that the NHS have started to say that they would prefer that, for the most part, that those weren't requested, just because it obviously impacts on their capacity. But if you do require them, they are available on the NHS website. Individuals can go on and register for an isolation note. Now, an employee who's in lockdown in another country is also classed as incapacitated for the purposes of claiming SSP and therefore entitled to sick pay for the period that they remain on lockdown and until they can reasonably return to the UK. Where employees are looking after children or other dependents, it's not usual where employees are looking after young children in particular, that you would also allow them to work from home, although some employers do. They just give flexibility at different times of day. However, rather than thinking about whether employees would automatically be on dependent leave for significant periods, it may be that they could share childcare responsibilities, and maybe in the short term they might be able to request a reduction in their working days or their working hours overall the week to be able to work part-time for a period as an alternative to being on dependence leave. And this is because dependence leave for most employers is unpaid. Some employers pay for a couple of days a year, or some large employers obviously do pay a lot more. But for most employers, it does tend to be unpaid or only paid for short periods. So what you need to consider is what pay you might be able to afford if staff could work part-time to fit around childcare or elderly dependents, for example, or if they can work home flexibly on a full-time basis while also caring for their children, but maybe working in a more flexible way. If they can do some of their work, for example, out of hours, once the kids are in bed, for example. Sorry, I've just realised I've got some slides on that and I haven't talked to them. I've just talked to the one slide. But these are, the webinar will be available offline if you do want to go through these slides in more detail later on. So moving to the action plan, this just kind of covers some of the actions that you can take from the webinar. And this is as much about recognising that it's sometimes, where do you start with these things? So you could sit down, write down what the impact of the business of COVID-19 is likely to be in the short to medium term. Review your staffing levels, your types of contracts, look at the different clauses, look at the job retention scheme and what that would give you, and see what flexibility you might have. Then review your policies in terms of what flexibility you can give for staff who can't be in the workplace, what you can manage in the shorter term. And then it's a case of formulating the approach that you want to take, communicating that with your staff, and effectively implementing your plan. So we have been given a half an hour of remote support that can be given directly to all of you. I say all of you, sorry, at the moment we've got 10 slots available, so it is on a first come first served basis. Where we think people might need further support, obviously we can go back and see if we can gain further funding for that. But if you do want to access the support, then you can email me, leslie@lansker.co.uk. It will be remote support, so we can organise a phone call or a Skype. And then if you want to send over any information in advance, then you can. And there will be, of course, the Excelerator Consortium will be continuing to let you know about any other support that may be available. If you've got any questions about immediate support that you feel that you require, please do get in touch with your relationship manager directly. This is for just a little reminder that where you are facing fundamental risks, where you are at the point where you potentially need some instant support, something where you are struggling quite significantly at the moment, we do have access to restructuring professionals that can help you to build a plan to address the priorities. Again, you have a conversation with your relationship manager and they can then signpost you to that AGP restructuring team. As I said earlier, this is the first of a couple of webinars that we have running this week. So there's the cash flow management webinar running tomorrow morning, and then the supply chain webinar running on Friday, and there will be further webinars potentially available next week. And as I said, there are other webinars also being developed based on demand. I know that you've been sent out kind of areas of priority to identify, so hopefully that will kind of pinpoint the support that you need. So thank you for joining me on the webinar, and I hope you found it helpful. We are going to move to a question and answer session now, and I'm just going to invite Lucy just to finally just to summarise a couple of things that she needs you guys to do before we do that.
Great, thank you. Yeah, just to reiterate what we said at the beginning, that you will be required to sign the digital registration form. So please do follow the link and confirm your attendance when you get that email through. Also, we're going to be sending out an email with the 2 surveys. We'd really appreciate if you could provide feedback to us, not only on today's webinar, but it'll also help us to continue to develop this webinar program for any support that you need at the moment. So yeah, hand back to Leslie for the Q&A session.
Okay, so I've had a quick look at the chat, and I can see we haven't got any questions specifically identified on chat at the moment. Or I have a new one, I might. Okay, I have. So let's have a look at this one. So at the moment, no. And in fact, I understand that the CBI were asking more questions about this yesterday. So are there more details around the staff retention scheme? I think all we really know at the moment is that employers are going to be required to register with HMRC, and that they should be able to claim 80% of staff salaries. As I said, that's when you can identify that you would have laid staff off. So this is an alternative to layoffs or an alternative to redundancy. Just double check. I hope I've answered your question there, Lynn. So, and I think what I would say is there's an expectation, I've seen this come up a few different places, an expectation that staff will have to be paid by the employer, and that then they claim the payback from HMRC. And that's the way, the kind of the chat that I've been reading in different places. Certainly that's the expectation. So when you're planning ahead, we would hope, of course, that scheme is going to be in place well before you needing to pay staff. But I think the expectation was that there wouldn't be any payments released until the end of April at the earliest. So a question around whether the staff retention scheme is available for directors. My recollection was of reading this, I saw this question somewhere else, was that there may well be a separate scheme for directors. However, if you are a director that's on PAYE, then I know many are, then potentially you should come under the umbrella of PAYE staff. But it may be that we can have a look and see if we can get a little bit more detail on some of that. And again, any of the questions I haven't got immediate answers to, we're going to try and keep a live FAQs for you that you can access later on. So at the moment, minimum wage increases, we haven't heard that they are being postponed or suspended, but it is, of course, something, again, I believe that CBI are pushing on as well to see whether that is something that's likely to be suspended. I would, of course, expect we're going to hear something on that anytime in the next couple of days, because the increases are expected to be in place from the 6th of April. So I can't immediately answer that question for you, unfortunately, Brian. So yeah, I mean, actually, Shelley, your question is quite a common one at the moment. Do we think the 80% is going to cover salaries only? My expectation is yes, from what I've seen on the chat. But again, that's just based on people's assumptions at this stage, that the 80% will only cover effectively what it has cost the company in terms of salaries. But we're expecting that again, that's a key question that's being asked, expecting more clarification to come on that, again, hopefully in the next few days. I do recognise that obviously staff are, these exactly the sort of questions that staff are likely to be asking as well. Okay, so a member of staff is in self-isolation indefinitely, don't have symptoms, want to protect themselves. Of course, there are quite a few people in this situation. Now, technically, the employee should make themselves available for work, and if they're not making themselves available for work, then then they're not meeting their contract effectively, and therefore you don't need to pay them. However, what I would say is that you need to have conversations to make sure that there's no form of a disability potentially in place. That might be more reasons to why the person is making the decision that they're making. Technically, this is a situation where later down the line, and you could be looking to end the contract, or an employee might be disciplined. However, of course, these things there would be an expectation that these things are looked upon as sensitively as possible. And I'd certainly be encouraging some dialogue to try and work with the employee to see what support you can put in place to allow this to happen, to support them if you can. If you can't, then, as I say, kind of spelling out to them that the risks or the decisions that you might take if they do choose not to return to work. Yeah, so there remains a duty of care to staff when working at home, and usually, of course, you would be going out to the workplace, you would be undertaking risk assessments, and quite often, of course, that is no longer acceptable because of social distancing. So I would suggest that you've still got responsibility to make sure they can work from home effectively. And if you're, as identified here from Heather, that they've got something that's causing them a back problem, there is an expectation probably on you that you would look to get them equipment that would allow them to be able to work from home. And I'm assuming there that there isn't a disability. If there were a disability, then potentially you might be able to get support through access to work to enable somebody to be able to work from home who hasn't previously worked from home. Yes, Andrew, question. Oh, sorry. Okay, hold on. I'm not sure whether that was shared to everyone. That was just about templates. We do have some templates available. Some templates have been developed around, letters and things like that. So what I can do is have a look at what I can make available to you, separate to this. Okay, so Christina, member of staff that started on the 2nd of March, if we have to furlough at a later date, would they be eligible for the 80%, or only people who are employed in February? That's a good question, actually, and I'm not entirely sure on the answer to that one, because I'm not sure again whether it is. Sorry, okay, I've been muted, unmuted. I am mindful of the time, everybody, and mindful that we did schedule this for 45 minutes. I do appreciate if people do. I'm happy to continue for the time being and see how many questions I can answer. If I do get to the point where we think quite a few people are dropping off, as I say, I'll put together the frequently asked questions, and you can then access those later on. So the member of staff who we have to furlough. So I think that it was said that the furlough payments would, as you say, go back to the 2nd of March. I know with layoffs, the employee has to have been employed for a month. So I don't know for definite the answer to that question, but I would have thought that it is it does include any new members of staff, but I will double check that question for you. Delayed a new starter. Yeah, absolutely. If again, this is individuals who are you've deferred their contract, assuming that there was a contract in place, they verbally accepted to a delayed start date, then you could then take them on and then furlough them. that is the expectation. Staff that work different hours would pay based on average over a 12-week period. So what I would say is, yeah, this is a little bit like the 0-hour contracts where staff, we don't know at the moment the basis on which the HMRC is going to base their calculations. What we do know, however, is if you're using a scheme and it's justifiable, so the 12-week period is not an unreasonable one. We've used that for quite a long time for holiday pay, for example. And I know obviously from the 6th of April, the Good Work Plan changes that, but it wouldn't be unreasonable to use that 12-week period to look at what their average pay would be until we get some further guidance from HMRC. So your question, Dennis, whether the company will pay the 80%, that is absolutely the expectation, that the company will pay and then that they will reclaim that from the government. Okay. Are we? Yeah, I think we are at the end of the questions. Hold on. So unless we let's have a look. So coronavirus, oh, hold on, I've lost your question, Christine. Sorry, Sarah. So the scheme will run for at least 3 months, backdated to the 1st. Workers must have been on PAYE at the end of February. Okay, thank you ever so much, Sarah. That's really useful. So Sarah's saying that actually, yeah, they must have been on PAYE at the end of February in order to qualify. So that it's not including employees who were in place, for example, at the start, who've joined after the 1st of March. So what's the timescale? So we've got furlough in place. What's the timescale before we could put redundancies into play if necessary? So, I mean, I think what you've got to think about in terms of redundancies is obviously the consultation timetable. You need to give staff notice to consult with them before decisions are made. So when there's an expectation that you're thinking, well, we could potentially be bringing staff back, then I would be expecting you to look to start redundancy consultation in advance of the furlough arrangements coming to an end. Again, we're hopeful, obviously we would have an expectation that we would know whether that 3 months was going to be extended, to give us notice to be able to plan for those eventualities effectively. What do we have here? Do we know when the HMRC portal is going to be? No, I think at the moment my understanding is that a lot of investment is going into that. An expectation, hope that they would have that portal online by potentially mid-April at the latest. But no, unfortunately, no timescales being identified at this stage. So can we return people to work immediately if other retained staff go off sick? That's a very good question, Debbie. And I would say that yes, that you would, there would be an expectation if you've got staff who are furloughed and other staff go off sick, then you would absolutely be looking to bring those furloughed staff back into work. And in fact, some companies potentially will have a strategy to do exactly that, to say, we know that we may well lose staff, we will furlough some groups of staff, keep some in the workplace. When then potentially those staff are unable to work, we will potentially rotate the furloughed staff that we have. Again, it depends what clauses you've got in place. It's about having conversations and managing staff expectations around when they may be furloughed, when they may potentially be brought back. Okay, so question. Yeah, so as we said, yeah, expectation, it's to be launched imminently. Yeah, as we say, we're obviously hoping it's going to be sooner rather than later, because it's bound to take a bit of time to work through, people understanding how it's going to work, getting people registered, being able to confirm that the information that's on there is correct. And as Sarah outlines, the hope is that it will be accessed through PAYE by an automatic payment. Okay, so we don't have any, so Danielle, we haven't got signed contracts in place. Staff have worked with the company for under a year. So, I mean, technically they're not entitled to redundancy payment, but they're still entitled to be consulted with. And even if you don't have signed contracts in place, then there will still be an implied contract in place, and they will be able to rely on the terms of those implied contracts potentially. So while you might think that there would be a reduced risk because they don't have any redundancy entitlements, there still may be a breach of that implied contract if you don't follow a fair process in terms of making them redundant. Apprentices, that's a very good question. And we are expecting there has been a bit of a guidance out about apprentices coming recent in the last couple of days, but not in enough detail to be able to identify exactly what we're able to do with them. In lots of cases, apprentices are treated exactly the same as employees. Now is actually quite a good time, particularly if you've got apprentices or traineeships in place, to signpost your apprentices to training that they can do at times where potentially when you might need them to be working more later on. So in terms of apprentices at the moment, that's all I can say, but I'll have a look at that for you, Amy, because I'm conscious that is actually a question that's likely to come up quite a lot, I think, over the next couple of weeks. Okay, let me have a look at what we've got here then from Mark. I'm going to make sure I don't lose my messages. Okay, so been planning to convert some casual self-employed labour on April 1st. Just got through accreditation. Had PAYE live, contracts signed as they started on the 1st of March. So the contracts, I mean, if what we're saying is that the contracts were signed, that they had started, then my expectation is, based on what Sarah said previously, that they should technically be in place as employees, and therefore you should be able to, I would have thought you should be able to include them. It may be one of those grey areas that we'll get a bit more detail on in time, but certainly I would be expecting you to go forward on that basis at this time. Okay. Oh, sorry, just trying to make sure. So how does furlough impact employees on long-term sick? So I think one of the questions I've seen come up in the last few days is, can a long-term sick employee, for example, return to work and then request to be made a furloughed employee effectively? And in principle, yes, they can. If they can demonstrate that they are fit to return to work, you haven't got work for them, then potentially they could come back as a furloughed employee. I hope that answers your question, the question that you were asking, Ivor. Okay. Laura, just looking at your questions around SSP. So at the moment, in terms of other high-risk categories, unless an individual has been informed that they must shield themselves, and I know there's lots of emails and text messages and whatnot been going out in different clinics over the last week or so, they, as you say, that they're entitled to SSP, sorry, if they have been kind of instructed to shield themselves. And at this time, as you identify, Laura, there isn't a financial support available. So the government is saying, yes, they can be paid SSP, but it's only then saying that SMEs can claim back for the first 14 days. Fully anticipate, again, that this is going to be an area that is going to be picked up to be progressed, because it is potentially, this is one of the situations where you might end up having to make somebody redundant because you can't afford to pay them for this period effectively. Okay. So if an employee started after the 1st of March, sorry, yeah, you're right, Amy. I think I did might have confused you all there. I need to double check in terms of the dates. My expectation is that even if you've got, this is about making sure that you don't lay staff off. You could have an employee that started after the 1st of March because you entered into a contract with them a couple of months ago. They were working their notice period, and therefore technically you've got a responsibility to continue with that contract and to pay them. And that therefore, but then unfortunately you're in a situation now where you might need to lay them off. So in that instance, they would be entitled to furlough pay. Even although I know that, Sarah, you did say that if they weren't on the payroll at the end of February, your expectation was that they wouldn't be entitled to furlough pay. But my understanding is that you would have contractual responsibilities to those individuals, and therefore I would have thought that if you had to then lay them off, then they would be entitled to furlough pay. But these questions that I've been a little bit grey on, I think, because I think a couple of these things are obviously technically quite specific. I will make sure that I pick up and include in more details in the FAQs where I can get specific answers for you. So if the employee is on long-term sick, do we leave them on long-term sick? If they are saying that they are still sick, then they remain on SSP. If they say that they are fit to return, but you can't, you don't have work for them and you would have to lay them off, then they would be entitled to be put on as furlough workers. So if in your question either they're on SSP, then they remain on SSP effectively. Okay, thank you, Sarah. I thank you again for reiterating and must have been on payroll from the 29th of February. As I say, I know there are circumstances where employees are, you are contractually obliged to take employees on, and I would have thought in that case, if you then have to potentially lay them off, this is an area that may need to be developed further in due course. But I appreciate what you're saying at this stage, Sarah, is that technically they wouldn't be covered if they weren't on payroll as of the 29th of February. Okay, we've come to the end of the questions. So I just want to thank everybody for joining me today. I say the webinar will be available online, probably with the exception of the questions at the end. I'll look to develop the FAQs for you, and we can keep this live and updated as we get more detailed information. So thank you very much, everyone. And as I say, hopefully the ones of you who signed up for Thursday and Friday seminars, that you I know that I've seen some of the information and really, really useful stuff. Hopefully you'll find those really useful too. Okay, thank you.